Mayday! Mayday! It's something we've heard 1,000 times in movies and TV, and hopefully never once in real life. When a grizzled sea captain's being tossed around by a storm, when a pilot's plane starts nosediving, or when an improbably attractive couple on a desert island who have remained improbably attractive after a month without hairstyling products or showers find an abandoned radio transmitter. Mayday is the first thing to come out of their mouths, but why do we say Mayday in an emergency? When and how did this almost universal custom start? Well, we were gonna strand your favorite lab rat to find out, but decided the airfare was too expensive. So where does Mayday come from? The word itself doesn't seem to imply danger. What's more peaceful and beautiful than a gorgeous sunny day in May? If you didn't know that this word was a distress call, it'd probably conjure up images of springtime, flowers, and sunshine. Well, the word originates from the French word Mayday, which translates to help me. It first started being used in England in 1923 when the majority of UK airline traffic was over the English Channel between England and France. Stories credit Frederick Stanley Mockford with coining the phrase in English, though some sources are unable to verify if he was the first person to use the word. Mockford was a senior radio officer in Croydon Airport in London. He was supposedly asked to think of a word that would be easily understood by all pilots and ground staff of both the French and English side of the channel in case of an emergency. Up to that point, SOS had been a pretty standard distress signal for ships at sea. However, ships at the time mostly communicated telegraphically. In Morse code, SOS was an easy pattern to both type out and decipher: 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots again. However, airlines communicated mostly via radio. Pilots soon realized that saying SOS on the radio, especially the more primitive radio communications that existed then, could easily be misunderstood. Why? Because as everyone who has spent hours on the phone with customer service endlessly repeating S as in Sam knows, the letter S is easily confused for several other letters. Which is why a famous pop singer is probably listed in some telemarketing records as Fam Smith. Pilots in distress couldn't really sit around repeating S as in Sam while their plane was in danger of hurtling toward the ground, so a new word needed to be thought up. That's when Mockford, the Croydon Airport radio officer, decided to go with the French version Mayday, or according to some sources, Mayday. The former is the imperative form of the verb, but they both sound just about the same. Naturally, the English-speaking radio officers bastardized it for an English use into Mayday. In addition to their cuisine and wine, this marks just one of the few times the French culturally won out over the English. After Mockford came up with the call, it spread so far beyond England it became so popular that the US formally adapted to Mayday as a radio telegraph distress signal in 1927, just 4 years later. The formal article to adopt it was passed by the International Radio Telegraph Convention in Washington. Even a few years after its inception, the distress signal was being used by pilots as far as Singapore. Eventually, Mayday was made official by most international bodies in 1948. So, when should it be used? Although it can be said in a variety of environments, it's most often associated with naval and air communication. On these naval and air vessels, most governing bodies indicate that Mayday should be used almost exclusively in life-threatening emergencies. Furthermore, even the way the word is said can help authorities understand what's happening. That's right, there is a protocol to how this distress signal should be used. When a pilot or captain feels there's an urgent, potentially fatal situation developing, they usually get on the radio and yell out Mayday 3 times. The call of Mayday, Mayday, Mayday is used to help ground control or operational centers understand which ship or plane is the one in distress. That's because if radio communications fail or are out of range on a vessel in peril, and nearby ships or planes observe one of their colleagues in distress, they might relay a Mayday message in order to inform authorities that another unit's in danger. Otherwise, they might be responding, addressing, or confirming a nearby Mayday situation if they're able to assist. So simply hearing the word Mayday come through on the radio, said only once, isn't an automatic sign that the ship or plane calling is also the one in trouble. When one vessel sends a distress call on behalf of another ship, it's called a Mayday relay, a somewhat cute phrase for a very real life or death emergency. Depending on the vessel one is operating and the country in which it is being operated, there are also specific instructions on which information to relay after a Mayday call. The Federal Aviation Administration of the US, or FAA, usually encourages the following format: Mayday, 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 name of station addressed, aircraft call sign and type, nature of emergency, weather, pilot's intentions or requests, present position or heading, or if lost, last known position or heading, altitude or flight level, fuel remaining in minutes, number of people on board, any other needed information. Because of the severity of a Mayday call, making a false call is usually punishable by a fine or even imprisonment in some countries. In the US, the punishment is up to $250,000 in fines or 6 years in jail. That might sound harsh, but consider the fact that when a ship or plane sends out this distress call, all resources and attention will be directed toward assisting the vessel, which means officers might end up neglecting other vessels in any kind of danger, or be unable to assist other vessels to the extent they could otherwise. In addition to time and energy, costly resources will also be diverted toward assisting or finding the vessel issuing a Mayday call. All this adds up to a lot of wasted time, manpower, and money if the call turns out to be a hoax. Moreover, once the pilot has declared an extreme emergency, many airspace regulations, such as speed and clearance limits, are rendered moot, and the pilot is authorized to do almost anything he deems necessary to correct the situation as long as it doesn't cause injury or death to civilians on the ground. Therefore, since the Mayday call also gives pilots great latitude in their actions, it's reserved only for the most urgent of situations. So what if a pilot has an emergency but not one necessarily threatening the lives of everyone on board? Well, for lower order emergencies, such as a mechanical failure or medical problem on board, or poor weather, getting lost, and low but not dangerously low fuel, the pilot will issue a distress call of pan-pan. We would not be able to do that with a straight face. Of course, it's French as well, with panne meaning breakdown. Anything that's not quite a, quote, grave and imminent threat requiring immediate assistance, end quote, as indicated by most naval and airline handbooks, will get a pan-pan instead of a Mayday. One last related distress protocol is that if the Mayday situation is happening on channels where other radio chatter and traffic are interfering, an order can be given out to stop all other communication on the specific frequency until the emergency has been handled, hopefully with a positive result. To be clear, usually all other chatter and communication on a specific radio frequency will cease once a Mayday has been declared without an additional order. However, if there is any additional interference, an order of silence Mayday will be given out. And yes, you guessed it, it is once again French. Silence is the approximate French translation of silence. When the order is given, it means the channel it's given on can only be used by the vessel in distress and the authorities handling the call. One of the reasons so many French words are used in emergency situations is because outside of French-speaking countries, they are easy to separate from the usual chatter that may be occurring via radio. So, are these the only phrases pilots use in a crisis? Well, not quite. Some pilots will go with alternates, such as declaring an emergency. However, the International Civil Aviation Organization highly discourages using any alternate distress signals, as they tend to cause confusion rather than help. As Mayday is currently the international standard for distress calls, using anything other than those words can mess up authorities' responses. Usually, authorities won't confuse the alternate distress call for long, but in a dire situation, even a momentary delay can make the difference between life and death. Also, if for whatever reason a Mayday can't be verbally given, a pilot or captain has a few other options. Every modern aircraft has a transponder which identifies the plane on radar. The pilot will set a 4-figure code known as a squawk code, given to them by the controller to help identify their plane popping up on radar. This 4-digit code will appear on screen right next to the aircraft trace. If the pilot can't speak or radio communications go down, he can input a special squawk code of 7700 to signal Mayday. This code will trigger an alarm in the control room which notifies all controllers that the aircraft is in serious trouble. Let's say a pilot sends out a distress signal, ends up sorting everything out, and then the plane lands safely with all the crew and passengers alive and well. What happens next? Well, every time a Mayday call is issued, that usually means a ton of paperwork for the person who issued the call, if they survived, of course. However, in more recent years, the FAA and other governing bodies have made allowances, depending on the type of emergency, to ease this burden for pilots, probably because the threat of a mountain of paperwork might be enough to make some pilots reconsider if their situation is really that much of an emergency after all. We've spoken a fair bit about officers making distress calls, but civilians can also make Mayday calls. For example, a regular person on their private boat facing danger or lost at sea can ask the Coast Guard for help via a Mayday call. Unfortunately, some people have taken to using Mayday calls as pranks. For example, a man in Rockland, Maine issued a Mayday call on December 3, 2020 to the local Coast Guard on a VHF FM radio channel. After they received the call, the Coast Guard started searching the area with a Maine Marine Patrol vessel, helicopter, and Coast Guard vessel for 5 hours to locate the man they assumed to be missing or in distress. The man was eventually identified and the call discovered to be a hoax, because some people are sociopaths in their free time. In response, the U.S. District Court of Portland, Maine filed a criminal complaint against him in January of 2021. The Coast Guard addressed the court by stating that hoax Mayday calls are not only degrading for authorities but detract from their ability to do their jobs and provide assistance to others who may be in real trouble. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard is particularly vulnerable to these hoaxes, as the VHF radio signals it uses to receive distress signals are nearly untraceable, making pranksters hard to identify. However, generally speaking, the universal adoption of the Mayday signal has been an incredible and necessary precaution to help aircraft, sailing vessels, and authorities around the world immediately declare and understand emergency situations, as well as coordinate the appropriate response. Now go check out this video here, or this other video instead.